JR, as he liked to be called, was the CEO of Sears Roebuck, which was on its way to becoming the largest retail establishment in the world. This is a story about the power of books, because in 1910, JR was sent 2 books by a friend, and they changed his life in a sense. These were both books about African Americans. He didn't really know much about African Americans. There weren't very many in Chicago at that time. And so one of these books was Booker T. Washington's autobiography. Booker T. Washington was the founder of Tuskegee Institute and described his journey from slavery to being the founder of Tuskegee Institute. The second book was the biography of the president of the Southern Railroad. He was white, and he was on the board of Tuskegee, and he was also involved in a Rockefeller Foundation, which was called the General Education Board, which dealt with giving funds for education to both blacks and whites in the South. JR was really interested in these 2 books, and shortly after he read them, he was visited by a delegation from the YMCA, which included a gentleman from Washington, D.C., an African-American gentleman. And these folks in the YMCA asked JR if he would be willing to give $25,000 to build a YMCA for blacks in Chicago. They told him that there was a real need for such a facility because YMCAs in those days were not just places of recreation, they were also places where people could live for a time. And there were no hotels for blacks in Chicago. If you were a black young man who was coming to Chicago to look for a job and you didn't have friends or relatives here, you couldn't go to a white hotel, and there was no place for you to stay. And so there was a real need for a facility like this. And JR listened to their pitch and responded almost immediately, which was kind of incredible. As a former fundraiser, I can tell you that's not usually done. So he gave him this challenge grant, as it's now called, to build Black Ys. And as a result of the challenge grant, there were 27 Black YM and YWCAs that were built throughout the country between 1913 and 1932. And the Wabash Y was one of the very first to be built. It wasn't the first, because the first had actually been almost finished in Washington, D.C., and so he gave money to finish it. But the Wabash Y was the first real one from this challenge grant to be built. And it was finished in 1913. And he gave a speech at the opening. And it became a really important part of the black community, as you probably heard. During the race riots of 1919, it became a sort of central place where workers could go and get their checks, etc. It was a very, very important part of the black community. Well, it wasn't totally unique. There were whites who were on the board of Tuskegee, for example, as JR later was. So he wasn't the first person to decide that blacks were worthy of support. What's interesting in my view is that he started out with the same prejudices as everybody else in his day. But as soon as he began to meet African Americans, he quickly changed his mind and realized that, in fact, he became quite radical in terms of the thinking of his day, because he believed that blacks and whites were equal and should be treated as equal. The other thing that's important about this building, and the other wise, is that he insisted that African Americans had to contribute something. And I think that was something that really hadn't been thought of. It was thought that maybe things should be done for them. But he felt that they should contribute too. And in fact, many did. And they some people, he was astonished to see that some blacks put almost their life savings into helping to build this building. He was greatly moved by that. Well, it's sort of history repeating itself, isn't it? The community helped to build it in the first place, and here they were working to restore it, which they've done, which is terrific. And this mural here is a sort of symbol of that, because it too has been recently restored. And I'm not sure that it was actually part of the original building, but it certainly is an important addition to it. Well, I'm very proud. I mean, I think I was brought up to understand something about philanthropy. I practice it a bit, and I'm very proud that he was engaged in this. And also, another thing that he did was to help build schools in the rural South for African Americans. He helped to build over 5,000 schools, which is kind of incredible. And these schools existed they were built between 1913 and 1932, and they existed all the way up until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. So they lasted quite a while, and they really had an important impact on black education. And it was Booker T. Washington whom he met shortly after having contributed to made the proposal for the YMCAs that induced him to start this program. And he got very much engaged in it. And then when Booker T. Washington died in 1915, he decided to continue it and expand it. So that's how 5,000 schools were built. And he didn't give all the money, just as he didn't give all the money to build the Ys. He gave about a third of the money. JR was also the founder of the Museum of Science and Industry, which I'm also proud of. But as far as the family connection is concerned, it extended for many generations, past my own. I think that many members of my family are interested and involved in working with black communities and help. One of the interesting things about the schools is that many of them are now being found and restored, and there's a whole movement that was done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation to find these schools and build them up. And so members of my family have also been involved in that. Others have written their own books about Julius Rosenwald and his school. There's even a movement to create a national park called the Julius Rosenwald National Park, which will be based on several of these schools, maybe about a dozen, which have been restored and which now have been repurposed. So some are senior centers, some are community centers, some are museums of African American history, and I think that that's really great. I think it's essential. I mean, we have to know something about our past, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and so I think it's very important to study all of this. I really do.